Intelligence sent us to neutralize a terrorist cell hiding in the catacombs beneath Paris. The map was ancient, and we expected a trap. The trap existed, but it wasn't for us. We found the terrorists and the assault team that came before us in the same state, massacred. The tunnels weren't a hideout, they were hunting grounds for something that had lived beneath the city for centuries, and we had just announced our presence. My name is Marcus Kane, and I've been leading special operations for NATO's counter-terrorism division for 8 years. When the briefing came through at 0400 hours that cold November morning, it seemed like another standard high-priority mission. The intelligence was solid. A cell of international terrorists had been using the extensive catacomb network beneath Paris to plan coordinated attacks across Western Europe. What made this particular group dangerous wasn't just their reach, but their access to military-grade weapons and their apparent knowledge of underground tunnel systems that most governments had forgotten existed. The briefing room at our forward operating base in Vincennes was packed with the usual suspects. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, our demolitions expert whose steady hands could disarm a bomb while under sniper fire. Sergeant Viktor Kozlov, our heavy weapons specialist who spoke 4 languages and had survived 3 tours in the most hostile territories imaginable. Corporal James Morrison, our tech specialist who could hack into any system or crack any encryption. And myself, tasked with keeping this elite team alive while completing what command assured us was a routine extraction and elimination operation. Colonel Matthews spread the ancient maps across the table, his weathered face showing the strain of too many missions like this one. The target is a network of at least 12 operatives who've been coordinating from a section of the catacombs approximately 2 kilometers beneath the 14th arrondissement, he explained, pointing to markings on maps that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a modern military briefing. These aren't the tourist sections, team. We're talking about tunnels that predate Napoleon, sections where the French resistance hid during World War II, and areas that even the local police avoid. What should have been our first warning was the fact that we weren't the first team sent in. Delta Squad, led by Captain Rodriguez, one of the most experienced urban warfare specialists in our division, had gone radio silent 67 hours earlier. Their last transmission was a routine check-in from the entrance to the catacomb system. Standard protocol would have been to send in a larger force immediately, but the French government was applying pressure to keep the operation contained and quiet. The last thing they wanted was news reports about armed military operations beneath one of the world's most visited cities. Delta Squad's mission parameters were identical to yours, Colonel Matthews continued, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't telling us everything. Locate, identify, and neutralize the terrorist cell. Secure any intelligence materials. Extract within 6 hours. Their communication equipment was state-of-the-art. Their experience level was exemplary, and they had the same intelligence package you're receiving now. The intelligence package itself was troubling in its gaps. Satellite imagery was useless this far underground. Thermal imaging had detected movement in the target area, but the readings were inconsistent, sometimes showing the expected number of heat signatures, other times showing nothing at all, and occasionally displaying readings that the tech analysts admitted they couldn't explain. The terrorist cell's communication intercepts had stopped abruptly 3 days ago, right around the time they'd moved deeper into the catacomb system. As we geared up in the pre-dawn darkness, each of us carrying enough firepower to level a city block, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The ancient maps showed a labyrinth of tunnels, chambers, and passages that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath Paris. Some sections were marked with warnings in French that Morrison translated as unstable, flooded, or simply forbidden. Other areas had notations that seemed to reference historical events, dates from the French Revolution, World War II, and some markings that appeared to be much older. The entry point was through a maintenance access in Père Lachaise Cemetery, chosen because it provided the most direct route to the terrorists' suspected location, while avoiding the main tourist areas of the catacombs. As we descended through the narrow concrete shaft that led into the underground maze, our helmet-mounted lights cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow the beams entirely, I remember thinking that this felt different from every other urban warfare operation I'd ever led. The air itself seemed wrong, not just stale or humid, but carrying an almost electric tension that made the hair on my arms stand up even through my tactical gear. The deeper we went, the more apparent it became that these tunnels had been carved by hand centuries ago. The walls showed tool marks from chisels and picks, and the construction techniques were far more sophisticated than I'd expected. Some passages opened into vast chambers carved from solid limestone, while others narrowed to spaces so tight we had to move single file. Our communications equipment began experiencing interference almost immediately. Not the usual underground signal degradation, but something that seemed to actively disrupt our transmissions with bursts of static that followed no recognizable pattern. 20 minutes into our descent, Kozlov stopped and held up his fist, signaling for silence. In the absolute quiet of the tunnels, we could hear something that shouldn't have been there. A low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't human voices, and wasn't anything any of us could identify. When we tried to radio it into command, we got nothing but static and what sounded like whispers in a language none of us recognized. That's when we knew this mission had already gone catastrophically wrong. The first sign that we were walking into something far worse than a terrorist hideout came 30 meters deeper into the main tunnel system. Chen's thermal scope picked up heat signatures ahead, multiple bodies in what appeared to be defensive positions, standard terrorist cell behavior when they know they're being hunted. What wasn't standard was the complete absence of any electromagnetic signatures from their equipment. No radio transmissions, no cell phone signals, no electronic devices of any kind. In an age where even basic terrorists carried encrypted communication devices, this level of electronic silence was impossible. "Contact ahead," Chen whispered through our short-range comm system, the only communication method still functioning in the increasingly hostile underground environment. Multiple heat signatures, approximately 40 meters. They're not moving. We approached using standard urban warfare protocols. Morrison covering our six, Kozlov providing overwatch with his heavy machine gun, Chen preparing breaching charges, and myself coordinating the assault. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber carved from limestone, with several passages branching off in different directions. Our tactical lights illuminated ancient French inscriptions on the walls, dates from the 1700s mixed with more recent graffiti and what appeared to be deliberately carved symbols that none of us could identify. The heat signatures Chen had detected were there, exactly where her scope had indicated. But they weren't terrorists preparing for a firefight. They were corpses. 12 bodies, all in tactical gear identical to what Delta Squad would have been carrying. But these weren't just dead soldiers. They had been systematically dismembered with a precision that suggested surgical knowledge combined with predatory efficiency. Their weapons were scattered around the chamber, some still loaded, others apparently fired until empty at targets we couldn't determine. The walls showed bullet impacts in seemingly random patterns, as if the soldiers had been firing at something moving too fast to track, or at multiple targets, attacking from impossible angles. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed, his voice barely audible even through our comm system. "What the hell did this to them?" Kozlov knelt beside one of the bodies, his combat experience evident as he examined the wounds without flinching. "These cuts weren't made with conventional weapons," he reported, his Russian accent thick with tension. "Look at the bone scoring. Whatever did this had claws or teeth, but the precision suggests intelligence. This wasn't animal predation. This was strategic dismemberment designed to incapacitate quickly and efficiently. Chen was scanning the branching tunnels with her thermal scope, her readings becoming increasingly erratic. "I'm getting movement signatures down multiple passages, but they're not consistent with human body heat," she reported. "The readings are fluctuating between warm-blooded and ambient temperature, like whatever's down there can regulate its body heat at will." As we processed this information, the implications became clear. We weren't dealing with a terrorist cell anymore. The terrorists had become prey, just like Delta Squad, just like us. Something had been using these tunnels as hunting grounds, and our military operations had simply provided it with fresh targets. The ancient maps suddenly made sense. The warnings about forbidden areas weren't referring to structural instability or historical preservation. They were warnings about something that the local population had learned to avoid through centuries of bitter experience. The terrorist cell's equipment was scattered throughout the chamber, mixed with Delta Squad's gear in a way that suggested both groups had been killed simultaneously, or close enough that their final defensive positions had overlapped. Encrypted hard drives, communication equipment, and weapons caches were strewn about like discarded toys. Morrison began collecting the intelligence materials, but his hands were shaking as he worked. Whatever had killed these men had done so with such overwhelming force that experienced special operations soldiers and well-armed terrorists hadn't even managed to wound their attacker. "We need to extract immediately," I decided. But even as I spoke, we heard it. The same rhythmic sound that had disturbed us earlier, but closer now, coming from multiple directions simultaneously. It wasn't quite breathing, wasn't quite footsteps, but something that combined elements of both with an underlying vibration that seemed to resonate through the limestone walls themselves. Kozlov trained his machine gun on the largest tunnel entrance while Chen prepared defensive charges. Morrison was frantically trying to establish communication with command, but our equipment was now producing nothing but static, punctuated by sounds that seemed almost like laughter, if laughter could come from something that had never been human. That's when we found the second massacre site. Down the eastern passage, another chamber revealed the remains of what appeared to be the terrorist cell's full complement. Not just the 12 operatives intelligence had identified, but at least 20 additional bodies, some in civilian clothes, others in military fatigues from various nations. The kill signatures were identical to what we'd seen with Delta Squad, but these bodies showed signs of having been there much longer. Some had been reduced to skeletal remains, with clothing and equipment that suggested they'd been killed months or even years ago. "This thing's been hunting down here for a long time," Chen observed, her voice tight with controlled fear. "These aren't recent kills. We're looking at a systematic predator that's been using the Catacombs system as its territory, picking off anyone who ventures too deep." The ancient inscriptions on the walls of this chamber were different, older, more primitive, and carved with what appeared to be warnings in multiple languages. Morrison translated what he could. French warnings about the guardian of the deep places, Latin phrases referencing the hunger that sleeps beneath, and symbols that seemed to predate any known European writing system. As we documented the scene, preparing for emergency extraction, the rhythmic sound grew closer. But now we could distinguish multiple sources. Not one predator, but several, coordinating their approach with an intelligence that suggested pack-hunting behavior combined with strategic thinking. Whatever lived in these tunnels had learned from centuries of encounters with human prey. It knew our tactics, our equipment, our limitations, and it was coming for us. The tunnel system around us began to echo with sounds that defied classification. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something that combined the worst aspects of both. Our lights began detecting movement in the peripheral passages, but whenever we focused on a specific area, whatever was there vanished with a speed that seemed to violate basic physics. "Contact!" Kozlov announced, opening fire down the main passage. His muzzle flashes illuminated something that retreated too quickly to identify, but left behind claw marks in solid limestone that were still smoking, as if the creature's touch generated intense heat. We were no longer hunters pursuing terrorists in an underground hideout. We had become prey in a hunting ground that predated our civilization, stalked by something that had perfected the art of killing humans in confined spaces, and our extraction route led deeper into its territory. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, demonstrating a level of tactical coordination that no animal should possess. Kozlov's machine gun fire illuminated brief glimpses of our attackers. Humanoid shapes moving with impossible speed and agility, scaling the limestone walls like gravity, was merely a suggestion. But these weren't humans, and they weren't any species from any biological classification I'd ever studied. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, when upright, but moved equally well on 2 legs or 4. Their elongated limbs ending in claws that could tear through military-grade body armor like paper. Their skin appeared to be a mottled grey-black that seemed to absorb our tactical lights rather than reflect them. And their faces combined the worst aspects of human intelligence with predatory features that belonged in nightmares. Most disturbing were their eyes, not the simple reflecting orbs of nocturnal animals, but complex, intelligent organs that tracked our movements with strategic assessment rather than mere hunger. "Fall back to the main chamber," I ordered, but retreat proved impossible. These creatures had been herding us, using the tunnel system's complexity to drive us into a killing ground of their choosing. Every passage we'd taken, every tactical decision we'd made, had been anticipated and countered by minds that understood both human psychology and the underground terrain better than we ever could. Chen's demolition charges bought us precious seconds, collapsing one tunnel entrance and temporarily blocking the western approach. But the explosions seemed to attract more of them. Through the smoke and debris, we could hear answering calls echoing from deeper in the catacomb system. Not the roars or howls of animals, but complex vocalizations that suggested communication, coordination, and what sounded disturbingly like laughter. Morrison managed to get a partial transmission through to command before our communications went completely dead. The last thing we heard from the surface was Colonel Matthews' voice, distorted by static but unmistakably urgent. "Abort mission immediately. Extraction team en route. Unknown hostiles confirmed. Do not engage." Too late for that advice. The creature's attack pattern revealed intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly familiar. They used suppressive tactics, forcing us to expend ammunition while attacking from multiple angles. They employed what could only be described as psychological warfare, mimicking human voices, sometimes speaking in languages we recognized, other times in dialects that sounded ancient beyond measure. Most unnervingly, they occasionally repeated phrases in perfect English, words they must have learned from previous victims. "Help me," one of them called from the darkness, using what sounded like Captain Rodriguez's voice. "The passage is clear. Follow my voice." Another creature, attacking from our right flank, spoke in Morrison's accent. "I found the exit. This way, quickly." But we could see Morrison right beside us, his face pale with the realization that these things had been listening to us, learning our speech patterns, preparing to use our own voices against us. They weren't just predators, they were mimics, capable of psychological manipulation that suggested they understood human behavior on a level that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Kozlov's ammunition ran low, and the creatures seemed to sense this immediately. Their attacks became more aggressive, more coordinated. One of them managed to get close enough that I could see details I wished I couldn't. Their claws weren't natural growths, but appeared to be deliberately sharpened bone and metal, suggesting tool use. Their teeth were arranged in patterns optimized for tearing through both flesh and modern protective materials. And their movements showed evidence of learning. They'd observed human combat tactics and developed countermeasures. "They're not just hunting us," Chen realized, her voice tight with terror as she prepared her last charges. They're studying us, learning from every encounter. That's when I understood the true scope of what we were facing. These creatures weren't some unknown species that had evolved in isolation beneath Paris. They were something far worse, an intelligent predator that had been systematically hunting humans for centuries, possibly millennia, perfecting their techniques with each encounter. Every missing person, every unexplained disappearance in the catacomb system had been a learning experience for them. The terrorist cell hadn't been hiding in these tunnels. They'd been driven here, herded into the creature's territory by some means we couldn't understand. Delta Squad hadn't stumbled into an ambush. They'd been lured into a carefully prepared killing ground. And now we were experiencing the full extent of what these things had learned from centuries of predation. Morrison screamed as one of the creatures dragged him into a side passage. His tactical light spun wildly as he fought, illuminating glimpses of the thing that had taken him, not just a monster, but something wearing pieces of equipment from previous victims. Dog tags, uniform patches, weapons modifications from different eras of military development. It was a walking museum of everyone it had killed, a deliberate display of trophies designed to terrorize its prey. "Morrison!" Kozlov roared, emptying his sidearm down the passage where our teammate had vanished. The muzzle flashes revealed more creatures waiting in the darkness, patient as spiders, confident in their ability to take us one by one. Chen's hand found mine in the darkness. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. "If we don't make it out, if these things are what I think they are, someone needs to know. This isn't just about Paris. If they're this organized, this intelligent, there might be others. Other cities, other tunnel systems." She was right. The implications were staggering. If creatures like this existed beneath one of the world's major cities, systematically hunting humans while remaining undetected by modern surveillance and military forces, what did that say about our understanding of our own planet? How many other underground predators might be waiting beneath London, New York, Moscow, or any of the dozens of cities with extensive subway and sewer systems? The creatures' calls grew closer, more confident. They knew they had us trapped. But in that moment of absolute terror, watching my team being systematically hunted by something that shouldn't exist, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let my people die without fighting back. And I wasn't going to let these things continue their centuries-long reign of terror in the darkness beneath human civilization. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, I was going to find a way to kill them all. The key to turning the tide came from Morrison's final transmission before they took him. In his last moments, he'd managed to upload a partial structural analysis of the catacomb system to our tactical computers. The data revealed what the ancient mapmakers had known but never explicitly stated. This section of tunnels wasn't naturally formed limestone caves. It was a deliberately constructed maze, designed with choke points, escape routes, and kill zones that could only have been engineered by the creatures themselves over centuries of refinement. But Morrison's analysis also revealed the maze's fatal flaw, a central chamber that served as the nexus for the entire tunnel network. If we could reach it, we could control the flow of combat instead of being systematically hunted through passages designed for our slaughter. "Chen!" I called through the chaos as another creature's claws raked across my body armor, leaving gouges in military-grade ceramic that should have been impossible. "Your remaining charges, can you bring down the support pillars in the tertiary passages?" Her eyes met mine in understanding. We weren't trying to escape anymore. We were going to collapse their hunting ground and force them into a direct confrontation on our terms. It was suicide tactics, but it was the only chance we had to save Morrison and potentially warn the surface about what lived down here. Kozlov provided covering fire as Chen and I moved toward the central chamber, his heavy machine gun keeping the creatures at bay through sheer volume of fire rather than actual hits. These things moved too fast for conventional aiming, but the psychological effect of sustained gunfire seemed to give them pause. Perhaps they'd learned caution from previous encounters with human weapons. The central chamber was everything Morrison's analysis had suggested. A vast circular space carved from solid bedrock, with dozens of passages radiating outward like spokes of a wheel. But it was also something else, a museum of horrors that told the story of centuries of human predation. The walls were covered with trophies, arranged in chronological order, showing the evolution of human technology and warfare through the lens of those who had been killed here. Medieval armor and weapons hung beside World War II uniforms. Modern tactical gear was displayed next to what appeared to be civilian clothing from every era of Parisian history. But most disturbing were the more recent additions, equipment from special forces units representing multiple nations, suggesting these creatures had been systematically hunting the world's most elite soldiers for decades. And in the center of this macabre display, suspended from the ceiling by chains that appeared to be forged from melted-down weapons, was Morrison. He was alive, conscious, and clearly being kept that way deliberately. The creatures weren't just predators, they were interrogators, extracting information from their victims before killing them. "Marcus!" Morrison's voice was weak but urgent. "They're not just animals. They can speak every language. They've been learning from everyone they've killed. They know about our base, our extraction protocols, everything." The implications hit me like a physical blow. These creatures didn't just hunt in the catacombs, they used intelligence gathered from their victims to plan larger operations. Every soldier they captured, every terrorist they interrogated, every civilian they took, provided them with information about the surface world. They were conducting systematic intelligence gathering on human civilization while maintaining perfect operational security by never leaving survivors. That's when the largest of the creatures emerged from the shadows at the far end of the chamber. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, its grey-black skin covered in scars that suggested it had been fighting humans for far longer than the others. But what made it truly terrifying wasn't its size or its obvious age. It was the intelligence in its eyes and the fact that it wore a necklace made from military rank insignia spanning centuries of warfare. "You are not the first special operations team to find us," it said in perfect English. Its voice a disturbing combination of human speech patterns and something fundamentally alien. "We have learned much from your predecessors, your tactics, your equipment, your psychology. You believe you are apex predators, but you are merely the latest in a long line of prey species that we have studied and mastered." Kozlov stepped beside me, his machine gun trained on the creature's center mass. "What the hell are you things?" The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that had been deliberately modified with metal points and cutting edges. "We are what your species becomes when it adapts to true darkness. We are evolution's answer to the question of what survives when the surface world burns. We have been preparing for the day when humanity drives itself underground permanently, and we will be waiting." Chen moved to my left, her remaining demolition charges armed and ready. The creature tracked her movement with casual interest, apparently unconcerned about our weapons. "Your explosives will not harm us significantly," it continued. "We have survived bombardments, gas attacks, and every weapon your species has developed over the past 5 centuries. But we appreciate the learning opportunity. Each new tactic you employ helps us prepare for future encounters." That's when I realized our true advantage. These creatures had been learning from every human they encountered, but they'd been learning from victims, people who were being hunted, captured, and killed. They'd never encountered humans who fought back effectively, who treated them as equals rather than superior predators. "Chen," I said quietly, "when I give the signal, bring down the ceiling directly above that thing. Kozlov, full auto-suppressive fire on the secondary tunnels. Keep the others from flanking us." The lead creature tilted its head, clearly understanding our tactical discussion. "Interesting. You still believe you can defeat us through conventional warfare. We have recorded similar confidence from over 300 special operations soldiers across the past 70 years. Their equipment now decorates our walls. Maybe, I replied, priming my own charges, but I bet none of them tried this. Instead of attacking the creature directly, I targeted the ancient support structure of the chamber itself. These tunnels were centuries old, carved when engineering standards were very different from modern construction. The creatures had modified and reinforced their maze over time, but they'd never considered that someone might deliberately trigger a catastrophic structural collapse. Chen understood immediately. Her charges weren't aimed at the creatures. They were positioned to create a cascading failure of the limestone ceiling that would bury everything in this chamber under thousands of tons of rock. It was suicide tactics, but it would also eliminate the primary nest and potentially save Morrison if we could get him clear in time. "Now!" I shouted. The explosions that followed weren't just demolition charges detonating, they were the sound of centuries of engineered predation, collapsing under the weight of human determination and strategic thinking that the creatures, for all their intelligence, had never encountered from their victims. The structural collapse was unlike anything I'd experienced in 8 years of urban warfare. The ancient limestone ceiling didn't just fall, it cascaded in a chain reaction that brought down support structures throughout the entire central section of the catacomb network. The sound was deafening, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the earth itself as centuries of carefully engineered tunnels collapsed into rubble. But the creature's reaction was what truly revealed the scope of what we were fighting. As the ceiling began to fall, they didn't flee or panic like animals would. Instead, they moved with coordinated precision, some attempting to reach Morrison, while others retreated to defensive positions in passages we hadn't even known existed. Their response was immediate, tactical, and demonstrated a level of organization that suggested military-style command structure. The lead creature, caught directly under the primary collapse, didn't die easily. As tons of limestone crushed down around it, it continued trying to coordinate its pack's response, issuing complex vocalizations that were clearly orders. Even as its body was being destroyed, it was attempting to ensure that its subordinates could adapt to our new tactics and learn from this encounter. Chen managed to reach Morrison as the dust cloud engulfed the chamber. His tactical harness was damaged, but functional, and she was able to cut him free just as secondary collapses began throughout the tunnel system. But Morrison's condition revealed the true horror of what these creatures had been doing to their captives. "They've been keeping prisoners for interrogation," he gasped as we helped him toward the nearest stable passage. "Not just recent captures. Some of the people down there have been alive for months, maybe years. They're conducting systematic intelligence gathering on surface operations, military protocols, everything." Kozlov covered our retreat, his machine gun chattering constantly as creatures emerged from passages that our structural analysis had never identified. But their attack pattern had changed. Instead of the confident, coordinated hunting we'd experienced earlier, they were now fighting defensively, trying to preserve their numbers while adapting to tactics they'd never encountered. "They're learning from this," Kozlov observed grimly as he reloaded. "Look at how they're positioning themselves now. They're already adjusting their approach based on what we just did." He was right. The creatures that had survived the collapse were demonstrating real-time tactical adaptation. They were using the rubble for cover, coordinating their movements to account for our explosive capabilities, and most disturbingly, they were retreating in organized formations rather than as individual predators. But the collapse had revealed something else. We weren't dealing with just one nest. As dust settled and emergency lighting from our tactical gear illuminated the destruction, we could see that our demolition had opened passages into sections of the catacomb system that weren't on any of our maps. These areas showed signs of much more extensive construction, suggesting a network that stretched far beyond what we'd been briefed about. Jesus Christ. Morrison whispered, staring at newly revealed chambers through gaps in the rubble. Look at the scope of this. These tunnels go for kilometers in every direction. This isn't just a nest. It's an entire underground city. Through the openings created by the collapse, we could see evidence of sophisticated infrastructure, carved chambers large enough to house hundreds of creatures, water management systems that diverted underground rivers, and what appeared to be breeding areas designed to support a substantial population. The terrorist cell and Delta Squad hadn't stumbled into a hunting ground. They'd discovered the edge of an underground civilization that had been developing beneath Paris for centuries. Chen's demolition had crippled their central command structure, but it had also revealed the true scale of what we were facing. The creatures we'd been fighting weren't just predators. They were advanced scouts for a much larger population that lived deeper in the Catacomb system. We need to get this information to command immediately, I decided. But even as I spoke, we realized that our communication problems had gotten worse, not better. The structural collapse had damaged whatever was jamming our equipment, but it had also triggered something else. Through the newly opened passages, we could hear sounds that suggested the larger population was mobilizing in response to our attack. The rhythmic vocalizations we'd heard earlier were now coming from dozens of different directions, echoing through a tunnel network far more extensive than anyone on the surface had ever imagined. But these weren't the coordinated hunting calls we'd encountered before. They were alarm signals, mobilization orders, and what sounded disturbingly like tactical briefings, conducted in a language that combined human speech patterns with something much older. Kozlov's ammunition was running critically low, and Chen had expended her last demolition charges in the collapse. Morrison was functional but wounded, and our extraction route led deeper into territory, now filled with an unknown number of hostile creatures that had just learned our capabilities and limitations. They're not just adapting to our tactics, Morrison realized, studying the newly revealed passages. They're calling for reinforcements. Look at the architecture in those deeper chambers. This population could number in the thousands. The implications were staggering. If creatures this intelligent and organized existed in these numbers beneath one of Europe's major cities, what did that mean for urban security worldwide? Every major city with extensive underground infrastructure, subway systems, sewer networks, historical tunnels, could potentially be hosting similar populations that had learned to remain undetected while systematically gathering intelligence on surface civilization. But our immediate problem was survival. The creatures that had survived our attack were now receiving reinforcements from the deeper tunnel network, and their new tactical approach showed they'd learned from their losses. Instead of direct confrontation, they were now employing siege tactics, surrounding our position and cutting off potential escape routes while waiting for superior numbers to arrive. Contact from multiple directions, Chen reported, her thermal scope picking up movement throughout the tunnel system. Estimated 30 to 40 hostiles converging on our position, but they're not attacking. They're establishing a perimeter. We were trapped in the rubble-filled remains of their central chamber, surrounded by an enemy that had just learned the hard way to respect human military capabilities. But we'd also discovered evidence of a threat to surface civilization that made our mission parameters completely irrelevant. The terrorist cell we'd been sent to neutralize was nothing compared to the underground population that had been studying human society for centuries while remaining completely undetected. And now they knew that the surface world was aware of their existence. The extraction didn't come from above, it came from below. 3 hours after our demolition charges had collapsed their central command structure, we heard the sound of heavy machinery cutting through limestone from deeper in the tunnel system. But it wasn't the creatures returning with reinforcements. It was a French military engineering unit equipped with specialized underground excavation equipment, guided by ground-penetrating radar that had detected our position. Colonel Matthews's voice crackled through newly functional communication equipment as the rescue team broke through. "Kane, report status immediately. We've got seismic readings indicating massive structural failure throughout the entire catacomb network. What the hell happened down there?" What had happened was that our mission had uncovered a threat to global security that made international terrorism look trivial by comparison. As the engineering team extracted us through emergency tunnels, Morrison shared the intelligence data he'd managed to recover from both the terrorist equipment and his own observations during captivity. The creatures we'd fought weren't just an isolated population. They were part of a coordinated network that had been monitoring surface civilization for centuries. "They have detailed knowledge of military protocols from multiple nations," Morrison reported as medics treated our injuries in the mobile command center. "Their interrogation techniques suggest they've been systematically capturing and questioning special operations personnel for decades. They know our base locations, our communication frequencies, our tactical doctrines, everything." But the most disturbing revelation came from the French government's response to our discovery. Within 6 hours of our extraction, they had sealed every known entrance to the affected catacomb sections and declared the entire area a national security zone. The official explanation given to the press was that structural instability had made the tunnels too dangerous for public access. The truth was that France's military leadership had realized they were dealing with a threat that could destabilize their entire understanding of national security. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a specialist in xenobiology from NATO's Classified Research Division, arrived within 12 hours to debrief us. Her questions revealed that our encounter wasn't entirely unprecedented. Similar incidents had been reported from underground locations in other major cities, but they'd always been classified and contained before reaching public awareness. "Your structural analysis confirms what we've suspected for years," Dr. Vasquez explained during our classified debriefing. "These entities represent an evolved branch of human development that adapted to subterranean environments over centuries or possibly millennia. Their intelligence, their tool use, their social organization, it all suggests they're not monsters. They're an alternative human civilization that has remained hidden while studying our surface development." The full scope of the underground network revealed by our mission was classified at the highest levels. But I learned enough to understand that we'd discovered just one node in a system that potentially extended beneath multiple continents. Satellite ground-penetrating radar had identified similar tunnel networks beneath London, New York, Moscow, and dozens of other major cities. The creatures we'd fought weren't unique to Paris. They were part of a global underground civilization that had been observing surface humanity for generations. 6 months after our mission, I was reassigned to a new NATO division that didn't officially exist. Our mandate was to develop defensive protocols for what military planners now classified as subterranean human variants, the formal designation for creatures that military leadership couldn't publicly acknowledge. Chen, Kozlov, and Morrison all received similar reassignments, along with psychological evaluations that emphasized the classified nature of our experiences. The terrorist cell we'd originally been sent to neutralize had been small players in a much larger game. Intelligence analysis revealed that they'd been driven into the catacomb system by financial pressure from surface authorities, making them perfect subjects for the creatures' intelligence-gathering operations. Their communication equipment had been compromised not by conventional surveillance, but by underground entities who had learned to monitor and manipulate surface technology. Today, I lead a specialized unit tasked with monitoring and responding to underground security threats in major urban areas. Our equipment includes detection systems specifically designed to identify subterranean tunnel networks and tactical protocols for fighting in environments where the enemy has centuries of territorial advantage. We've conducted operations in 12 different cities, and every mission confirms the same disturbing pattern. Humanity shares this planet with an intelligent subspecies that has been studying us while remaining completely hidden. The official casualty report from our Paris mission lists Delta Squad as killed in action during a terrorist engagement, with no mention of the true nature of their deaths. Morrison's intelligence data has been classified and distributed only to military leaders with the highest security clearances. The French government maintains that the affected Catacombs sections are closed due to structural instability, and tourist access to the underground areas has been permanently restricted. But those of us who survived know the truth. Beneath every major city with extensive underground infrastructure, there may be populations of highly intelligent predators who have been perfecting their understanding of human behavior for centuries. They know our tactics, our technology, our weaknesses, and our social structures better than we know ourselves. They've been patient observers, waiting for opportunities to gather intelligence while avoiding detection. The most troubling aspect of our discovery is that these creatures appear to be preparing for something. The intelligence Morrison recovered suggested they believe surface civilization is approaching some kind of collapse that will drive humans underground permanently. When that happens, they intend to be ready. My current mission parameters include developing early warning systems for underground threats and training elite units to fight in subterranean environments where conventional military advantages are neutralized. Every major city now has classified protocols for responding to what official documents refer to as subsurface security incidents, though the public remains unaware that such threats exist. 3 years after Paris, I can confirm that we've identified active underground populations beneath at least 30 major cities worldwide. They remain hidden. They continue gathering intelligence through systematic predation of anyone who ventures too deep into tunnel systems, and they appear to be coordinating their activities across continental distances. The war against international terrorism continues on the surface, but those of us with the highest security clearances know that humanity faces a much older, much more patient enemy that has been studying us from the darkness beneath our feet. They've learned our strengths and weaknesses through centuries of careful observation, and they're waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. When that moment comes, we'll be as ready as any surface military can be to fight an enemy that knows everything about us while we're still learning they exist. The mission that started as a simple terrorist neutralization operation has become humanity's first line of defense against a threat most people will never know exists. But we know, and we're watching the tunnels.